Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. A clerk asks one simple question. Where were you born? Susan answers without hesitation, but the screen frowns back at her. Her name doesn't exist. Her birthplace doesn't exist. Her entire life erased in a single click. What if everything you thought you knew about yourself was a lie?
Before we go deeper into Susan's story, I need to ask you something. Families searched for her for 53 years. They never stopped hoping, never stopped looking. If they could hold on for decades, the least you can do is help keep her story alive. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Every voice, every location reminds the world that missing children are never forgotten. Don't just watch silently. Be part of the fight against silence.
Susan was just 4 years old in the summer of 1969, growing up in Pontefract, West Yorkshire. Life was simple, ordinary, and modest. Her parents were working class, juggling long hours and tight finances, but their home was held together by love. Susan wore hand-me-down clothes from her older siblings, and her laughter echoed through the narrow streets where children played tag until the streetlights flickered on. Family dinners were plain but filling, and bedtime stories often competed with the clatter of coal trucks rolling through the town. To Susan, this was safety, the comfort of brothers and sisters close by, and the unshakable belief that parents would always be there to protect her. And yet, this was England in the late 1960s, an era when communities were close-knit and trust in neighbors was almost sacred. People left their doors unlocked, borrowed sugar from next door, and thought nothing of letting children wander between gardens. It was a culture of trust, where the word family friend carried as much weight as blood. But what happens when that trust is betrayed? One day, into this trusting circle walked a couple. They weren't strangers. They were known, familiar, friendly, the kind of people who could step into a kitchen, pour a cup of tea, and be welcomed without hesitation. They smiled warmly, spoke kindly, and wrapped themselves in the cloak of respectability. But hidden behind their charm was something darker. They were welcomed with open arms, yet carried secrets in their smiles. To Susan's parents, they seemed like friends. To Susan, they would soon become something far more dangerous.
It began with a promise that sounded harmless, even generous. A short trip, a holiday to Scotland. Fresh air, beaches, castles. For a working-class family who could not afford such luxuries, the idea was tempting. What harm could there be in letting a trusted couple give their daughter a holiday? The couple insisted, "She'll be treated like our own. We'll take care of her." And with that, the seed was planted. Her parents packed her a tiny bag, kissed her goodbye, and let her walk hand in hand with the people they thought were friends. They believed they'd see her again in a week or two, brimming with stories of adventures. They could never have known they had just watched their daughter walk out of their lives. For Susan, the betrayal was not immediate. At 4 years old, she didn't know the meaning of broken promises or manipulation. But as the years passed, a more insidious lie took root, one repeated often, delivered with conviction, and designed to sever her from everything she once knew. Your parents didn't want you. We took you in because they couldn't be bothered. That sentence, delivered like a knife to the heart, reshaped the way Susan saw herself. What does a child do when the people raising her claim her parents abandoned her? She believed it. She had to, because what else could she do? She was too young to question, too young to understand. The lie festered, becoming the foundation of her identity. She wasn't loved. She wasn't wanted. She was disposable. That single, devastating deception would shadow Susan for decades. It turned a joyful little girl from Pontefract into a woman haunted by a question she could never answer. Why wasn't I enough? And in that unanswered question, the seeds of her stolen life began to grow. It was a summer morning in 1969, and Susan's world was about to change forever, though no one in her family could see it coming. Her parents helped her pack a tiny bag, a few clothes, a favorite toy, the little things a child might need for a short holiday. Her brothers and sisters gathered around, teasing her about all the adventures she'd have. Her mother kissed her cheek, her father ruffled her hair, and they waved from the doorway with hopeful smiles. To them, this was a gift, a chance for their little girl to see castles, beaches, wide green fields in Scotland. For Susan, at just 4 years old, it was the promise of excitement, a holiday with people she trusted. What none of them realized was that this farewell was not for a week or two, it was for the rest of her childhood. The couple who promised Scotland never intended to bring her back. Instead of heading north, they took her away, first across the Channel to France, then further still to New Zealand, and finally halfway around the world to Australia. With every border crossed, Susan's past was stripped further from her. Each mile erased her roots, her name, her very identity. Back in Pontefract, her family waited, counting down the days until their daughter's return. But days became weeks, weeks became months, and there was no knock at the door. The holiday was a lie, a cruel deception that stole a child in plain sight, right under the nose of her community. For Susan, the confusion began almost immediately. Where was home? Why wasn't she going back? And most painful of all, why didn't her parents come for her? Every time she asked, the answer cut deeper. They didn't want you. We took you in because they couldn't be bothered. Imagine hearing that as a child, not once, but over and over, until it hardens into belief. For Susan, it became the truth she carried into adolescence, into adulthood, into motherhood. A quiet ache that whispered, "You were never wanted." And here is where I want to ask you directly. Imagine being 4 years old, bright, playful, loved, and then being told your parents gave you away. Imagine growing up with that story echoing in your head for decades. How would that shape the rest of your life? Would you ever truly feel like you belonged? When Susan failed to return from her holiday, her parents went from anxious to frantic. At first, they clung to hope perhaps there had been a delay, perhaps she was still in Scotland. But as days turned into weeks, their dread grew unbearable. They went to the police, begging for answers. Reports were filed, statements taken, but the truth was devastating. The couple had disappeared, and so had their little girl. In the late 1960s, police systems were painfully limited. There were no international databases, no instant alerts, no Amber Alerts flashing across screens. Once Susan was taken across a border, she might as well have been swallowed by the earth. Her father later admitted it felt like shouting into a void. She just vanished into silence. The authorities had no trail, no cooperation from abroad, and no answers for a grieving family. Meanwhile, thousands miles away, Susan was being raised under a false name in New Zealand and later Australia. On the surface, her life looked ordinary. She went to school, played in the sun, and grew into a young woman. But beneath that veneer, the cracks were everywhere. She had no birth certificate she could see, no photographs from before the age of 4. Whenever paperwork was needed, her so-called parents insisted on handling it. If she asked too many questions, she was shut down. The message was always the same: you don't need to know. Your real parents didn't want you. Susan was living, as one journalist later described it, like a ghost in plain sight. She existed physically, but on paper, she didn't exist at all. She carried an identity that wasn't hers, a name built on lies, and a past erased by deception. And all the while, back in England, her brothers and sisters grew up, married, raised children, with an empty chair at every family gathering where their little sister should have been. It wasn't until decades later, in her 60s, that the truth finally broke through. Susan walked into a government office in Australia to apply for a passport, something millions of people do every year without a second thought. She filled in the forms, handed over her details, and waited for routine confirmation. Instead, the clerk frowned. Her name didn't match the records. Her birthplace couldn't be found. The document she'd lived by her entire life didn't exist. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a clerical error. But as she pressed for answers, dread set in.
She went home and asked the couple she had always believed were her parents. Their reaction wasn't reassuring. Instead of producing a dusty birth certificate or an old record, they deflected. They stalled. They told her it was lost, misplaced, buried in storage. Each excuse felt thinner than the last. Susan's stomach knotted with suspicion. For the first time, she refused to let the matter drop. She began digging herself. With her husband's support, she requested official records, searched archives, tried every avenue to prove she was who she thought she was. And that was when she realized there was nothing to prove. Her entire legal identity was missing. She tugged on a thread, and half a century of lies began to unravel. The investigation led her back across the ocean to fragments of her early life in Scotland and England. Piece by piece, the truth came into focus. She hadn't been abandoned at all. She had been stolen. Stolen under the guise of a holiday, taken from parents who loved her, and cut off from siblings who had searched for her for decades. Then came the message. A letter from Scotland. Its words were simple, but they carried the weight of 5 lost decades. "We've found you. You're our Susan. Please come home." Susan held the letter in trembling hands, reading it over and over. The story she had been told since childhood, that her parents hadn't wanted her, was shattered in an instant. They hadn't given her away. They had never stopped looking. Yet, as miraculous as the reunion was, there was also a haunting truth. No one faced justice for Susan's abduction. The couple who had taken her across borders escaped prosecution, shielded by time, distance, and outdated legal frameworks. More than 50 years had passed, and the law had no answers for the theft of an entire childhood. And so the question lingers, chilling and unresolved. How many others vanished, never to be found because systems failed? How many children, like Susan, disappeared in plain sight, hidden not in shadows, but behind forged documents, false names, and lies repeated often enough to be believed? 53 years after she was taken, Susan stepped off a plane in Scotland. The cold air hit her face, but it wasn't the chill that made her tremble. It was the weight of everything she carried inside. Across the barrier, her siblings waited. In their hands, they held a faded photograph of a little girl in pigtails, the sister who had vanished in 1969. For decades, that photograph was all they had. And then it happened. The photo slipped from their hands as they ran to her. Susan froze, just for a second, her mind catching up to the impossible sight before her. And then she was in their arms. They wept, clutching her as if they could fold the lost years back into the present. Their voices cracked as they said her name, not the name she'd been forced to live under, but the one she was born with, Susan. For the first time since childhood, she heard her true name spoken with love. She cried, not as a grown woman, but from the deepest part of herself, the child who had been silenced, lied to, and made to believe she was unwanted. That child was finally being held again. The reunion was joyous, but also bittersweet. Their parents had gone to their graves never knowing what became of their daughter. Birthdays had been celebrated with one chair empty. Milestones, weddings, funerals, grandchildren born had all passed without her. Each sibling had lived with the ache of not knowing. For Susan, the pain of what had been stolen was overwhelming. She had missed not just years, but a lifetime. Anger surged, anger at the woman who took her, anger at the silence of the system that failed her family. Yet stronger than the anger was something else. Love. The kind of love that had endured half a century, across oceans, despite lies.
Her inner transformation was profound. She was no longer a stolen child defined by deception. She was a reclaimed sister, a daughter, a woman with a family she thought she'd lost forever. In that moment, she wasn't just finding them, she was finding herself. News of Susan's return spread quickly. Headlines around the world described it as a miracle, a missing child found alive after 53 years. People were shocked not only by the endurance of her family's search, but by the chilling fact that she had been living in plain sight the entire time. The case sparked uncomfortable questions. If Susan could be hidden for decades, her true identity buried under forged documents and lies, how many others are still out there? How many families still wait for a knock at the door, a phone call, a letter that says, "We've found you"? Susan's story became more than a personal triumph. It became a symbol, a reminder of the failures of the past and the enduring hope of families who refused to give up. Susan will never get her childhood back. The years are gone, the birthdays missed, the parents who died waiting, the childhood memories that were stolen. But what she did reclaim was just as powerful. Her truth, her name, and her family. And for Susan, after 53 years, that was everything. Her story is haunting, but it is also hopeful. It shows us that time cannot fully erase love, that truth can survive even decades of silence. So the next time you see the face of a missing child, on a poster, in the news, in a photograph someone still clings to, remember Susan. Behind every picture is a family that never stops searching, never stops hoping. Because sometimes, against all odds, the missing do come home.
Susan's story proves that even after half a century, hope can break through the silence. But for countless families, the waiting continues. Don't let their stories disappear. If this case moved you, share this video so others never forget that behind every missing child's face is a family still searching. Comment below where you're watching from. Let Susan's family and families like hers know that people around the world stand with them. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Every time you do, you help keep these stories alive, ensuring the missing are never left in the dark.